there, everyone. Welcome back to Utility Sports with another off-season preview today, and we're focusing on a very intriguing team and a team that has a lot of variance in potential pathways that they could look this off-season, specifically because of one big-time hire from a person who, played in the NBA and then also went on to be a GM, president of basketball operations. They knew exactly what they were doing when they hired this guy, and we all know who I'm talking about. That's Danny Ainge. So Jazz fans, buckle up. Today's going to be a really fun offseason preview. If you are new to the channel, also make sure to subscribe. It'd be greatly appreciated. I've loved doing all of these offseason previews. My goal is to do 30 of them, one for each NBA team. We've already knocked out half of them, so we're going at a pretty good rate here. The playoffs have been treating us very well as well. So let's go ahead, jump forward. If you are enjoying the content, make sure to leave a like on today's video as well. Go follow us on our socials, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Those are in the bio of today's video. Now let's jump into it here with a video preview. What exactly are we going to cover in today's video? Well, we're going to talk about last season, because last season is really what the most recent thing that happened that's important, right? If the season ended differently, we'd probably be talking a little bit differently about Utah. We'll talk about the record, some bright spots that I had for this Utah Jazz team. There's, maybe not as many as you would think for a team that finished 5th in the Western Conference. Then key decisions to make. Is it Danny Ainge's time to shine? I think potentially it is. So we'll see exactly what he could look to do this offseason. We also have another video that I'll shout out later in this video. 2022 NBA draft, we'll look at their NBA draft assets. You notice that there's no NBA draft targets. That's a little bit of a spoiler to where they're currently at. 2022 NBA free agency, we'll look at their cap space situation, who they can maybe look to target then with where they're at. Of course, they are a very interesting team because you usually look at Utah as a smaller market, but that hasn't stopped them from paying quite a bit of money on the roster in recent years. So we'll talk about where do they go from here? Do they add more talent? Do they kind of maybe sell off the margins a little bit and try and get back under the luxury tax and more? And then next season, what are the goals and what are the expectations that are realistic for this Utah Jazz team? Utah so close to making the conference finals the year that Kawhi Leonard got hurt, and they just couldn't get the job done against the Clippers. And then, you look at the time where the Nuggets made it to the conference finals. They lost in 7 games to them. The Jazz have been highly competitive, but it's hard to really pin them as a big-time playoff contender at this point, just because of some of the shortcomings we've seen in Donovan Mitchell's early career, and also with Rudy Gobert in recent years. Now, I'm not blaming either of those two players. I think there's a collection of flaws on this roster outside of those two, but we have to talk, what could we realistically see from Utah next season? So now, let's talk about this past season. Like I said, that's where we're starting here. Remember, they went 49-33, which is a really good record. They lost to the Dallas Mavericks, however, in the first round. In this loss, Dallas is a good team, but the loss is way worse than it even feels, because the first couple games, you faced Dallas without Luka Doncic. You couldn't get the job done, couldn't pull ahead 2-0, ended up going down 2-1, couldn't get the job done on their home court, and then ultimately, at the end of the day, put themselves in a position where they just couldn't win that series, even though Luka Doncic came back a little hobbled. He looked great still, but Utah just clearly was not the better team in that series, even despite a massive injury in that one. Everyone last year looked at Donovan Mitchell's ankle injury against the Clippers. Even though he was playing and Kawhi Leonard was not, Jazz fans still had a good, feeling on why their team didn't win, because Donovan Mitchell was dealing with an injury. Mike Conley was. But now in recent memory, we saw Kawhi Leonard not play for the Clippers. Clippers won that series. We also saw Luka Doncic miss almost half that series against Utah, and they still lost to the Mavericks, which is obviously a concern. We'll talk about some of the reasons why later on in this video, though, and how I think they can correct that moving forward. Bright spots. First of all, same old from the Stars. You saw the same old stuff from Donovan Mitchell, and you saw the same old stuff from Rudy Gobert. Both of them at least knocking on the door of an all-NBA selection. Both of them were really great again this season. Donovan Mitchell, one of the premier guards in the league. There's no denying that, specifically offensively. The one thing I would like to see from him is maybe a little bit more buy-in defensively. He's got all the traits to be a good defensive player. He's got a pretty sturdy frame. He's got very quick feet and pretty quick hands as well. We saw that a lot in Louisville. back before he came into the NBA. And it's funny because a lot of people questioned his offensive game coming into the league. I actually remember I was at Donovan Mitchell's first career game. I played at the Target Center in Minnesota, and his first career shot hit the backboard from 3 and missed terribly. And I thought to myself, oh boy, if this is what Donovan Mitchell is going to be offensively, Utah might be in a little bit of trouble here. Of course, it's kind of flipped now. He's a phenomenal offensive player, and the defensive side of the game has really kind of faded. So that's what I want to see from him. And then, Rudy Gobert, the chemistry between those two, there's definitely questions. I know a lot of people kept bringing up how many times he passes in the ball, and I think it was pretty apparent even watching them this year before all those stats went around that Donovan Mitchell just doesn't feel confident dishing it to Rudy Gobert, partially because Gobert just doesn't catch the ball with regularity. But also, I think that, Donovan Mitchell, who's grown a lot as a playmaker since getting into the league, just probably doesn't get along with Rudy Gobert and doesn't even look for him in certain cases. The lob in the series against Dallas where, Rudy Gobert flushed it home for what was the game-winning dunk, I thought that was going to be huge for those two guys. And when they made that play, I thought, wow, maybe they've got Dallas on the ropes, but it ultimately didn't lead anywhere. They had a tough Game 5 loss, and then ultimately Utah rolled over in that series. So same old, plays from them. I just think that there needs to be improvement from both of those guys. Then you have a collection of really good players. That's another bright spot here. Bogdanovich, you got Clarkson, who's good. I know his efficiency was down this year, but he's still a good player. Royce O'Neal, he's really fit into a pretty solid role. Mike Conley down a little bit this year from where he was in prior seasons, but still, a starting level player at this point of his career, I would say. And then also Hassan Whiteside played fairly well. I think that was a pretty nice role player find for them. We'll talk about him a little bit later on in this video. Then also you have the long-term look ahead to Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who they were able to bring over in the Joe Ingles trade. I know that's probably not the most popular trade in Utah Nation because Joe Ingles was very beloved, in that locker room, and also just was a really good player when he was healthy. Obviously that injury kind of changed things there in Utah and opened up that move for them. And it's possible we could see a Joe Ingles reunion back to Utah. And then beginning of the season, that's another bright spot. This team started out really great. I think, that was so long ago, people forget about it. Utah was playing great basketball. They were right there with Phoenix and Golden State at the start of the year. And then I think COVID really hit this team harder than maybe any other team. And that's obviously going to happen when you have some chemistry concerns. And also your defense was solely predicated on one player. And the fact that, Rudy Gobert missed some time this year leaves you very viable to giving up a lot of points, losing a lot of games in a short period of time. And I think ultimately Utah was stung by COVID-19 worse than most teams were this past season. Even if the games missed weren't even more significant, I think the players that were missing time was a more significant loss to Utah than to most teams. Then we look at key decisions to make, and this is where Danny Ainge gets to really show up. This is Danny Ainge's decision. Is he going to make a rash move? Is he going to make a blockbuster deal? Is he going to sit quiet? Is he going to, make some moves on the margins? We really don't know. Danny Ainge is someone who really liked to, make a lot of moves when he was working in Boston, and we've seen it work out well. He was the engineer behind the Brooklyn trade that is oh so famous now, trading away Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett. He's also the guy who brought Kevin Garnett to Boston. He's made a lot of really great trades. He's set them up. He drafted Tatum, Jaylen Brown. He knows what he's doing, but he's only been here for a little bit less than a year at this point. Is he in a position right now where he feels confident to move on from either one of Rudy Gobert or Donovan Mitchell? And spoiler alert right now, it's not going to be Donovan Mitchell. Okay. Rudy Gobert, 29 years old. He will be the guy that they would, broach offers on. Does he get moved? Does he not? That's to be seen yet. I think that there's going to be some serious conversations around the league between Danny Ainge and other executives. And I think that they're going to explore every single potential move that they could make. It doesn't mean that they ultimately do make one, but I would be absolutely shocked if Rudy Gobert's name isn't mentioned in trade discussions with all 29 other teams, even if it's just exploratory. Then you also have to look at the remaining portion of the roster. Whether Gobert gets traded or not, I think there's going to be a series of other moves as well. If you trade Gobert, you're not going to get someone who can defend the paint like he can, so you better make other moves to find more perimeter defenders and also someone who can maybe help you down low as a rim protector. And even if you don't trade Gobert, we clearly know this just doesn't work. You can't have one superstar mega defensive player, 3-time defensive player of the year, and expect your defense just to be perfect when everyone else on the floor is incapable. They asked Royce O'Neal to guard point guards. That's just not a reality. Okay, Royce O'Neal is not quick enough to stay in front of the Jalen Brunsons of the world, and I couldn't imagine watching him try and stop Chris Paul or Devin Booker out in space. Good luck, Utah. That's just not going to get it done. So either Donovan Mitchell needs to become a plus defender out of nowhere again, or you need to make moves to get plus defenders on this team. Mike Conley's not the same guy he was 7-8 years ago in Memphis. That's just the reality. Utah doesn't have enough perimeter defenders, and if you're going to trade Gobert, who's your best interior defender, you better have ways to really improve this roster. Then also Hassan Whiteside's headed toward unrestricted free agency. Talked about him a little bit earlier on in the open. I think he is a solid role player at this point of his career. Clearly not the same guy he was in Miami, but ultimately I do think he could serve a role as a drop coverage big in today's league. You know, he's still lengthy and a menace around the rim defensively when he actually puts in the effort to do so. That's, you know, about 70% of the time seemingly, but when he does it, he is rather good at it. He's also a pretty good defensive rebounder. So if you're looking for a player to keep, Hassan Whiteside does make a lot of sense, even if Rudy Gobert gets traded or not. Then we move on to the 2022 NBA draft, and this is where we get a little sad if we're a Utah Jazz fan. 0 draft assets. Of course, their first round pick out to the Memphis Grizzlies in the Mike Conley deal, which feels really not great at this point. Obviously, this pick is rather low. This is in the 20s. It's not the end of the world that this pick is belonging to Memphis, but it just quite frankly doesn't feel good either. And then the sad thing is they have been moving second round picks for quite some time. You look at the Derek Favors deal as a potential reason as to why as well, when they brought him in on the mid-level exception and ultimately 1 year later decided they didn't want him anymore and traded him away. They've put themselves in a position where they don't have second round picks this year either. So could they move back into the draft? Yes, they could. They could maybe even be picking top 15 in a deal with, say, Charlotte for Gobert, who has picks 15 and 13. 13 is not guaranteed. It could potentially be top 4, but the odds are saying that it will probably be pick 13, maybe even pick 14. But Charlotte here at this point could be looking at Gobert very heavily. And then also top 3 in a deal for Mitchell, which I don't think it'll happen. But if you're trading Donovan Mitchell, you're going to get a top 3 pick in this year's class. And it would be a good building block to at least start discussions on a Donovan Mitchell trade. Ultimately, though, I just don't see it happening. Donovan Mitchell will be a Utah Jazz player next season. And then they could also look to maybe trade back into the second round. They could use cash, which we've seen multiple times in years past. The Clippers are king at this, where they trade, $500,000 or $2 million, whatever it is, to get back into the second round and draft a player they like. Utah, with their new rich owner, definitely could look to do that. Or they could maybe even use some of those role players and save money on the margin like I talked about. I don't love that option, especially while you're trying to compete, but it's a potential outcome that Utah could consider, specifically if there's a player like, say, Ron Harper Jr. from Rutgers out there in the second round. I think maybe then at that point they should consider it. He's a very good defensive wing who's versatile and can cover a lot of different spots on the floor. So I would love him for Utah, but ultimately I don't think that they're going to give up a lot of role players to get back into the second round. Then you look at NBA free agency, and Utah Jazz fans know that Utah is probably not the most attractive destination for free agency, but a few years ago they did bring in Bojan Bogdanovic, and that was huge for their roster. That really kind of transformed what this team could be. However, this offseason they're projected to be over $37 million over the cap. So they are in cap purgatory right now. They're probably not going to be able to go out and make any type of big move. Obviously there's still the sign and trade where you send Gobert somewhere maybe, or you send a Mike Conley or a Bojan Bogdanovic. But at this point, I just think that's a little rich to expect, specifically for Utah. I just think, if this was the Lakers or the Clippers, which I know this isn't fair and Jazz fans probably don't like to hear it. And I get it, Jazz fans. Media has harped on you guys. And I feel like if I was a Jazz fan, I would never listen to the national media because everything they say about my team would be negative. And I'm not trying to be very negative here, but ultimately, I just don't see Utah getting a Zach LaVine or a Jalen Brunson or any of the top free agents this offseason, which is okay. You've got a lot of talent already on this roster. And then the issue too is they don't even have their non-taxpayer mid-level. They were a taxpayer this past year, so they actually only have the taxpayer mid-level exception available to them, which is around $6.4 million. So they've got a little bit of wiggle room, not a ton. I already mentioned Joe Ingles as a potential free agent target for them. For me, it doesn't even feel like a free agent target. It just feels like the reunion is almost certain. But then other targets here. You could look at an Ishmael Wainwright from the Phoenix Suns, who hasn't gotten a lot of playoff time, but throughout the regular season was actually a very pleasant surprise. I actually caught on with the Toronto Raptors, I believe, in NBA Summer League. Didn't end up sticking on there, but Phoenix picked him up quickly, and Phoenix has made a lot of really good decisions. Wainwright was definitely one of them. I think he's a player who has a long NBA career ahead of him. He's someone who, if he keeps shooting the three ball, well, he could last in this league for a long time. So I think here with Utah, you're getting a defensive-minded forward who's got really good length and strength. And I think that's something missing from Utah. They're just not very strong. They don't have a lot of good defensive length. They just don't have a lot of good defensive players. So it's no surprise here that the three players I'm targeting are all defensive-minded. Gary Payton II, who obviously sustained a terrible injury this postseason from the Dylan Brooks play for the Memphis Grizzlies. Gary Payton II is an awesome defensive player, though, and has really come along in his offensive game. Kind of plays into that Bruce Brown role a little bit, where you'll use him as a screener and a dive guy. Can also step into the corner, knock it down. That's really where his biggest growth was this past season. We always knew Gary Payton II, aka the Mitten, was going to be a really, really good defensive guard. It was all about trying to find his offensive game, kind of like what we see with Matisse Thybulle in Philly, except it's harder here with Gary Payton II because he's a little bit smaller than a Matisse Thybulle. So it's always hard finding minutes for small guards unless their offensive game really comes along, and Gary Payton II's has. And then also Javon Carter, who was a sneaky good pickup from Milwaukee. I was shocked when Brooklyn released him this year, even though, you know, he wasn't playing his best basketball by any stretch. But when you look at this player, he's someone who can pick up 94 feet. Like I said, has quick hands, quick feet. He can move with the best of them on the perimeter. I think, again, Utah, one of the biggest issues, and this is what I talked about earlier a little bit, with guarding Dallas, is you could not stay in front of Jalen Brunson, who, yes, he's very sneaky. He's got a crafty little footwork maneuver to his game where he goes stride, stop, up, under, and score, or he goes stride, stop, fade away, bucket. He's got a lot of little quirks to him. So I understand why it's difficult to guard him, but getting 41 points dropped on your head by Jalen Brunson in a playoff game probably isn't the best look. You need someone who's a little bit smaller, a little bit quicker, and Javon Carter, Gary Payton II, those two guys fit the bill. And realistically, with the money, with Gary Payton II coming off of an injury, you might be able to get all three of these guys. So Utah could go into next season with a host of defensive players already added on very cheap contracts. Maybe you can keep Daniil House as well, who I think would be a really good retention for them. I really like Daniil House heading into free agency this offseason. I think he's going to be a really good budget find for a team. So I think Utah could really add some decent players pretty quickly on cheap contracts, just given the circumstances. And then you go into next season and you have to wonder yourself, what can this Utah Jazz team be? And it's going to be dependent on Gobert. If he's traded, we're going to see massive regression. I mean, massive. This team is going to be fighting in the play-in, unless it's accompanied by a bunch of other trades, which Danny Ainge is definitely capable of. Now, you might be saying, wait, so trading Gobert and then trading everyone else makes you better, maybe? Yes, if you position yourself well enough, you can trade Gobert, get a good collection of assets back and maybe a good young player, and then you go from there and you try and build a fit. This Utah Jazz team just doesn't fit because they can't guard anything on the perimeter when it comes to playoff basketball. So you need to find players who can, and that's maybe where you make other moves. Maybe you trade Bojan Bogdanovic and some assets you get for Jeremy Grant, or maybe you trade Jordan Clarkson and an asset you get for a defensive-minded wing who fits. There's moves here you can make. Yeah, you're taking a risk by making a bunch of moves, but at the same time, there's a very high reward where maybe you start winning. Maybe you build a small ball lineup around Donovan Mitchell. Maybe we start seeing more point Donovan Mitchell, which I think is questionable. But if you have enough shooting and enough playmaking with defense around him, maybe it's enough to get the job done. Utah could really remake themselves this offseason. And if Gobert's not traded, the goal is to be a top 4 seed again in the Western Conference. And realistically, the goal from there should be get to the Western Conference Finals. And that's not crazy to say. I know this past season didn't end the way they wanted it to. Dallas kind of walked them off the floor. But if Gobert's still there, Donovan Mitchell's there, you make a few tweaks to this roster, add in some more defensive players specifically capable of guarding quick guards, you could set yourself up to make it to the Western Conference Finals. And then once you're in the Western Conference Finals, you need one little tweak ankle injury. You need the ball to bounce your way just a couple of times. And all of a sudden you're playing in the NBA Finals, right? It's very, very close. People don't really realize how the second round of the playoffs and the finals, you can have a margin of error this big to get in. And realistically, if Utah puts themselves in a position where the ball bounces right for them a couple times, it's not crazy to imagine Utah at least getting to the Western Conference Finals if they're healthy and they tweak this roster a little bit. Jazz fans, hopefully you guys did enjoy today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope, first of all, that you guys don't think I was too negative in this video. I tried steering away from the negativity. I think it was very easy to focus on the negativity. And, you know, I definitely had to talk about some of the negative aspects, but I tried to steer away from it. Realistically, you guys have 2 great players, and that's more than most teams can say. So that's kudos to you guys. We'll see how Danny Ainge goes about it. I'm sorry for the national media being so terrible about you guys, but hopefully you did enjoy today's video. If you did, like the video and also subscribe to the channel for more NBA coverage. Make sure to go check out our Rudy Gobert trade ideas video as well. There'll be a card in this video for that at some point. Again, thanks so much for watching, guys, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.